Welcome. If you've just joined us, I've got solicitor Nick Freeman and historian Tessa Dunlop with me, and we're going to be getting straight into what we were just debating with Storm. Is the government right to allow new oil fields? We want to get your calls on this, so give us a ring. 0207 862 2222 is the number that you need to get your calls in. In a moment, we're also going to be putting your calls and your questions and your thoughts to presenter Chris Packham. Now, the government have said that development and production approval has been given the go-ahead at a large oil field known as the Rosebank, following reassurances over environmental concerns. It's estimated that the site could provide 500 million barrels of oil. Now, is this a good decision from the government, Nick?
Yes, it's a necessary decision. I mean, it's bizarre, but I think it goes hand in hand with Rishi Sunak's U-turn last week on delaying the zero-emission cars until 2035. So we've got a period now where we're going to need to fuel cars. Where's that fuel going to come from? And we do need to gather our independence in terms of supplying fuel. You know, it's all very well having wind and solar, but that's a tiny, tiny part of our fuel supply. 80% of the world's fuel supply at the moment is on fossil fuels. So we need this, particularly when we've got hostile countries around us. It's all very well, but if there's a problem in the world, are we going to say to the population, I'm so terribly sorry, it's not windy, it's not sunny, we've got no energy. Okay. We've got that there, we need to use it, but we still need to be alive to the fact that by 2050, we've got legal obligations to meet. OK. Now,
it's important to say that about 20% of these oil fields are UK-owned, a company called Ithaca. The rest of them are Norwegian-operated. Tessa, the government is saying, look, even with our obligations to 2050, this has been taken into account, and we as a government are happy to go ahead with this. Important also to say that Labour have said that if they come into power, they won't revoke any licences that have been given out pre-election.
Yeah, that's characteristically spineless of Rishi Sunak, incidentally. Are we happy to give Equinor, which is a Norwegian firm, a tax break worth over £3 billion? In other words, every £100 that this Norwegian firm invests, they will get a £91 in every £100 they spend back from us, the British taxpayer? That's my first question. Of all the countries in the world I would love to grant a British tax break to, one of them would not be the oh-so-rich Norway. The second point is, just picking up on you, do you drive a car that runs on oil, Nick? You talked about we need to fuel our cars. Does your car run on oil?
Yes.
Does it really?
It runs on petrol.
Yeah, petrol.
Petrol.
Right.
Petrol.
Because actually what is being, or what they hope to extract out of the ground is 90% oil, so not gas.
It uses oil as well.
And most 80% of the oil that they extract is not the sort of oil that we use in Britain in our refineries. Mm-hmm. It will be sold on the international market, and if we want to buy it, we will have to buy it at market prices. So the idea that this is in some way future-proofing us is absolute poppycock. And I had to snigger when you delicately put it that this was hand in hand with Rishi Sunak's U-turn. It's very hard to hold hands when you're turning round. Okay. You get in a knot.
All right. We'll carry on talking about this, but we are now going to be bringing in a wildlife expert and conservationist, Chris Packham. Chris, thank you so much for giving us your time. I really appreciate you joining us this morning. We've got plenty to discuss, but let me just pick you up on your tweet this morning, Chris. When you heard the announcement of this new granting of drilling permits, you said this is no less than an act of war against life on Earth. Do you really see this as the government waging war on the environment?
It's certainly firing a shot at it. I think Tessa has already outlined some of the reasons why we have grave concerns about the Rosebank oil field providing any energy security, which is what Nick was intimating might be the case. But either way, what we know at this point in time, and when I say we, I'm not talking about Chris Packham and his eco-zealot, eco-mob friends. I'm talking about the Secretary General of the UN. I'm talking about the Climate Change Committee, the government's own body, is that we need to transition away from our dependence on fossil fuels as rapidly as possible. That's no ambiguity about it. Secretary General said that to continue to exploit them is economic and environmental madness. We know, as we turn on our televisions throughout the course of the Northern Hemisphere summer, that we've seen very significant weather events which are related to climate breakdown in Europe on our doorstep. And we're now moving into a Southern Hemisphere summer where the El Nino, the Pacific current, which is currently exacerbating this, is going to be even hotter. And we're going to be seeing devastating effects in the global south, where millions of people are already losing their livelihoods, their businesses, and their lives as well due to climate breakdown. And we in the UK have the responsibility and the ability to implement measures to ameliorate all of these things, to become leaders. We can invest in new, bright businesses to aid that transition away from that dependence, investing in those renewables.
Okay.
And that's what a bold and brave leader would do. And at the moment, we're being led to hell in a handcart by a weak government which is only interested in short-termism, and that isn't going to help our children and grandchildren.
Chris, the government in its defence will say, look, by 2050, it's not that we're not going to be using any fossil fuels at all, even if we do get as close as we can or meet our 2050 obligations of net zero. What they're putting forward is if we're going to be using oil, it's better that we use oil that comes from the North Sea. We're not having to import it from far across the globe, places like Canada, places like the US, Saudi Arabia. That will reduce the carbon footprint of the oil that we do have to use. What do you make of that part of the argument that the government's coming forward for?
Well, as Tessa's already explained, the vast majority of the Rosebank field is owned by the Norwegian company Equinor. Frankly, whoever pulls the oil out of the ground owns it. We'll have no say what happens to that oil. And again, as Tessa's already pointed out, it's not the sort of oil that we use for domestic use. What we need to expedite this problem and to make sure that we do indeed have energy security all the way through that transition is investment in those renewables now. And we've just seen our government not get any applications for offshore wind in the UK during the last round of licensing because basically it priced people out. And it continues to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure, providing grotesque subsidies to those businesses. Businesses, I like to point out, that are posting record profits. Now, we've just gone through a winter and we're set to go through another where many people could not afford to heat their homes. And they go on to your programme and others and see that the petrochemical giants, Centrica, essentially British Gas, are posting record profits. This is a time when our government ought to have been punitively taxing those people to help us through that transition. Okay. If you're living in London and you can't afford to swap your old diesel vehicle for a new electric one, you're living in one of those ULEZ zones, then you should be subsidised. This should not be a tax upon the poor. What we should be doing is taxing the mega rich, and that's those petrochemical companies.
OK, Chris, stay with us. We've got plenty to discuss. And I know lots of people at home want to join the conversation. Ray in Buckingham wants to join in. Ray, good afternoon. What would you like to say?
I can't understand the fact I agree with getting the oil because I think this country needs it. But as I understand it, we're going to sell it on the open market. Now, I would like to keep it here. Why? Because we'll be importing oil from other countries. Why would it go on the open market? It must cost more in CO2 emissions and all this.
As you heard from Chris and from Tessa, the people who take it out of the ground own it, and they can put it out on the open market. And but
they need our licenses. They need us to.
OK, well, that's what Chris and Tessa are objecting to, that perhaps the British government shouldn't have been given the licence.
Not to companies that would export it from this country.
All right.
Stay in our eyes.
OK, Ray, you've made your point. Let's take another call. Chris in Manchester. Chris, what would you like to say?
I'd like to ask Chris and Tessa, stop oil, is it just in Britain you want to stop oil or throughout the world?
Chris Backham, would you like to stop oil just in Britain or throughout the world?
No, it's a global concern. Obviously, people will say that the UK is only responsible for a tiny percentage of the global emissions which are precipitating our climate breakdown. They will say, therefore, that we ought to focus our campaigning on countries which are much more serious polluters, India, China, United States. But that's not the point. The point is that we have a duty and a responsibility to contribute to the rectifying of this situation. We, as a wealthy nation, have the ability to invest in those industries, as I've intimated. But it's a global concern. But there are many places in the world where they will not be able to afford that transition as easily as we can in the UK. And therefore, we have to support them as well. And the conferences of parties, the COPs that we have frequently now, one of the key sticking points there is how much the rich Western nations help the poorer nations move through this transition, because they're the ones currently that are suffering more than we are. So the unjust situation, the lack of equality, is something that gives us grave concern. But no, to answer that question simply, the whole world needs to transition away from this dependence, not just the UK.
But Chris makes such a good point. Historically, we led the world into the Industrial Revolution. We profited from it, and we helped initiate this heating up of the globe. And we have to take, therefore, responsibility. But secondly, we are so well positioned to do so. We are an island, a series of islands with wind, with waves. Let's catch it. Let's run with it. Let's lead.
OK, I can tell you, looking at the app on carbon emission, well, the carbon energy that we produced, wind yesterday produced 25%. So it's 25%, but then we had to rely a little bit on gas, another 25%, and on nuclear. We're getting there. Nick, you don't look convinced.
Well, there's going to be a shortfall, and what I'm concerned about is when there's a shortfall and when other countries who are currently hostile to us decide, sorry, we're cutting your supply, where do we go? What do we say to people? Sorry, there's no heating. You can't run your cars. You can't do this. You can't do that. We need to sustain ourselves. So it's a balance. We're moving to 2050. It's an admirable situation. And everything you say with Chris, I completely agree with. But we have to balance the economies of scale. And just, we have this on our doorstep. We can finance it. We can get money out of it. And that puts us in a position where we can help poorer countries. If we don't have the financial worth, we're not in a position to do anything.
Let Chris come back on that. Chris, how do we get there? How do we balance it without sort of turning the taps off?
Well, the first thing, Nick, is that as far as I'm aware, no hostile countries can stop the wind. They might be able to turn the pipelines off, gas and oil, but they can't turn the wind off. And if we were generating 25% of our energy yesterday by wind, and we had 75% more wind turbines, then one might imagine we'd be a lot less dependent on those countries, and our independence, so craved for by so many people in this country, might be realised. But it's not just about that energy security. It's about generating jobs. It's about helping people through a transition, those people working in the oil and gas industries at the moment, to make sure that their families, their communities have secure economic futures. And this requires bravery and investment. It doesn't mean short-termism just to get a government re-elected and frankly send the rest of the world to hell in a handcart, because we are continuing to fill our atmosphere with dangerous gases which are heating up the entire planet.
Chris, thank you.
And at this point, that's where we're looking.
OK, Chris, I'm going to pause you there only because I've got to go to break, but I know that you're staying with us, and I really, really appreciate you giving us all this time. Thank you. And thank you for your calls on that. In a moment, we're going to be asking, is it OK to break the law in order to save the planet? Later on, we're going to be bringing you the latest topics. But we're going to be asking this question in just a moment. Is it OK to break the law in order to save the planet? Or do you think it's a step too far? Give us a call. 0207 862 2222 is the number that you need. We'll speak to you after the break. There's a big wall of gum. I don't know why, but it is there. Welcome if you've just joined us. Nick Freeman, Tessa Dunlop and Chris Packham are still with me. Here's a reminder of what's coming up on the show. In a moment, we're going to be asking if it's ever OK to break the law in order to save the planet. It's something that Chris has been considering, and he's been doing. The documentary that went out last week was about this, and we're going to ask him about that in just a moment. But we want to hear from you. Would you ever break the law in order to save the planet? Then we'll take a look at what everyone else has been talking about online, including how the British Museum is asking for your help to find some of its lost treasures. And later, we want to know if you think it's OK to skip a day or two between having a shower or a bath. You can call us on any of that. 0207 862 2222 is the number that you need. Calls from landlines may cost up to 16 pence per minute, plus any call setup fees. And calls from landlines may cost considerably more. Send us a message, head over to Facebook, Twitter, search for Jeremy Vine on 5, and you can use the hashtag Alexis Conran. Now, your calls on this. I've been very much looking forward to doing this debate. Is it ever OK to break the law in order to save the planet? Now, Chris, this is a question that you asked in your documentary, which I watched last week, and I found it absolutely captivating because it's an incredibly poignant question, and a question that you struggled with, if I may be so honest. Tell us a little bit about it. Where are you now with that question? Have you come to an answer?
At this point in time, I'm not inciting anyone to break the law. I'm asking everyone to use what remains of our democratic process in the UK to protest about things like the Rosebank oil field being granted a licence that we spoke this evening, those very dangerous impacts that will have negative impacts on our climate breakdown. What we've seen in recent months, indeed the last couple of years, is our government crack down on our democratic right to protest. You can get arrested now for simply wearing a T-shirt standing on the pavement. You can get arrested as a 68-year-old retired social worker for carrying a placard which has wording written on a courtroom wall about our right to jury trials in the UK. So there is a degree of oppression there. It's a lot easier for people who want to protest to actually break the law. And then, of course, on top of that, when they do, we're seeing quite obscene draconian sentences to protesters from Just Stop Oil, who blocked the traffic, have gone to prison for 2 years and 7 months and 3 years, respectively. So it's increasingly difficult. And look, let's face it, we've got to be honest with ourselves. You know, a lot of us break the law all of the time. We exceed the speed limit, unfortunately. We park on double yellow lines. Recently, a former head of the Conservative Party suggested it was okay for people to smash up the ULEZ cameras in London. So we tend to set our own opinions because we judge our own ethics and morals against the law. And that was what was at the core of our programme. At what point does it become more an ethically responsible thing to do to take action than obey the law? And that was the question that we posed our viewers and the participants. Okay. What we found in our programme is that quite a few of our climate protesters and politicians too were predicting that at some point in the future people would break the law, for the very simple reason that our politicians are not listening to our protests at the moment. They are granting drilling rights to things like Rosebank, and therefore protesters will escalate. That's what history shows us. Through all of our social change movements, that unfortunately is what happens. We're not advocating that, we're predicting it.
Okay, Chris, lots of people have been wanting to have their say on this, so let's hear what they have to say. Thank you for staying with us, Chris Packham. Kathy in Cheshire, good afternoon. Kathy, what would you like to say?
Not to do anything silly and against the law and end up in prison. You can't do anything there. What you need to do is keep showing the films of what's happening to the animals, the rivers, when they get knocked down. Just keep showing the films that you've been showing about the creatures and the rivers and everything. Don't do anything silly and end up inside. The anti-protesters will cut their hands.
Okay, Kathy,
can't do anything in there, can you? Just keep
Kathy,
showing the film.
Let Chris come back on that. I mean, okay. I think that's a bit more of a plea to you, Chris. Keep informing people about what's going on, but don't do anything that might see you go to prison. But you addressed this in your film as well. Do you think that the amount of protest that we've seen, the disruptive protests we've seen in Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, has it worked? Do you feel that that's not doing enough? Therefore, you might have to take it a step further.
Well, it's not whether I have to take it a step further, it's whether people will. And to answer your question, has it been working, essentially? Has the climate protest movement been working? Well, after this morning's announcement, last week's announcement, we could argue that it hasn't. We've all taken to the streets with our banners. A lot of us have done so perfectly peacefully, democratically and lawfully, but our voices have not been heard. And that's what frightens me. If our voices are not heard, then people will, history shows, escalate their protest to make sure that their point is made. And that's a dangerous precedent being set by our government when it's clamping down on our right to protest and our right to justice. And that's something I agree with your previous contributor, that lady. Thank you very much for your kind comments. At the moment, I'm very lucky to be able to exercise my voice, as I am today at your invitation on this programme, to point out some of the problems that we face. If people like myself who have that voice end up in jail, then of course we won't be able to do that. So perhaps we are better off exercising our peaceful right to protest. And in a way, I'm protesting now, you could argue. Other people, though, may not take that step. And that's what we're worried about.
Chris, I've got to ask you this again, because I found your documentary very touching, and you raised, as you said, a lot of very ethical issues. If you happen to find yourself having to go to prison, do you think you'd be okay in prison?
Well, that's a question for all of us to answer as individuals. Our characteristics, our personalities are all very different. Some people clearly adapt to living in confinement. I visited a prison during the course of making that programme. I found it a terribly oppressing environment. I've always felt that about prison. And as you know, I'm a man who likes to spend his time outside in the wild, in the woods. I think I would very much struggle in prison. And therefore, perhaps my decision to be made at some point in the future is which side of the law do I stay on, where I am most effective to make sure that this protest eventually wins out. But I say, other people may not have my mindset. From my point of view, I think this is a time where the climate protest movement needs to exercise its creativity and its imagination. It's where it needs to spread out into comedy, into music, into sport, all of those other inputs into our cultural lives, where at the moment the message is not being carried. I mean, look at the music. How many people stand on stage, as I can't do, with a guitar behind a microphone, singing to stadiums filled full of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are not conveying this message? In a way, that's kind of irresponsible. They have a voice. They should be putting that voice to good. There are many good causes, but saving the planet and the human species is surely at the top of it. OK,
Chris, there's so many people who want to have their say as well. Let's speak to Ian in Gwynedd. Ian, good afternoon. What would you like to say?
I'd like to say to Chris, I've got great admiration for him. I'm as passionate about the environment as he is, especially wildlife and particularly birds. And I would like to save him from going to prison. And my point is entirely pragmatic. Whatever he does is not going to make the slightest difference to the climate. We produce less than 1% of climate emissions. It isn't going to make any difference at all to the climate. If it were to prevent the Chinese, the Indians, the Russians, the Brazilians, even the Polish, even the Germans from producing carbon dioxide, then it might have a point. But it would have no effect whatsoever on the climate.
OK, Ian, I'm going to stop you there because I've got to squeeze in more calls. I think, Chris, you addressed this a little bit earlier, but what do you say to someone like Ian, a supporter of yours, but he's saying, look, others are out there doing much worse than us. How do you deal with that point?
Well, that doesn't mean that we let them carry on doing much worse than us. An analogy I use is, imagine you're standing in the playground and there's a big boy over in the corner having a wee. Do you go up to your teacher and you say, is it okay if I have a little wee in the other corner? Of course it isn't. You keep your playground clean. We've got to keep the world clean. We are one species on one planet with one massive problem and one last chance to sort it out. We can't think as parochial England versus China versus India. We're all in this together. We're breathing Indian Chinese air and they are breathing UK air, and we don't want polluted UK air. OK,
Nick, it would be remiss of us not to get your thoughts on this as someone who is familiar with the law. Where does the law stand with such protests, people breaking the law?
Well, I think that you need to keep the people's voice. The rule of law keeps society together. It keeps our democratic society together. And the moment it's broken, you lose the will of the people. And Chris, you're doing a fantastic job. And I admire your work and I admire what you say. And the best way you can communicate that message effectively is by staying on the right side of the law. Because as you've witnessed recently with certain types of protests, the public get fed up of having their lives totally disrupted and you lose their will. And once you've lost their will, you've lost the argument.
Nick, why don't we call out our law-breaking government? Who's going to put them in prison when we fail to meet our international, legal, binding commitment in 2050?
Well, they haven't done it.
Who's going to bang up Rishi for his decision today that's going to land us in the soup tomorrow?
But they haven't broken the law yet.
But we know that they set target limits year on year, which they're now rescinding, and those target limits were imposed because they worked out they were necessary to arrive in 2050 with clean hands.
The legal obligation arises in 2050.
Oh, right, put it off to tomorrow.
But They are. They're dealing with it incrementally. They've put it back. Bizarrely, I agree, another 5 years, and I can explain that. But at the end of the day, the fine line is in 2050. Have they met their target or not?
Okay,
and that's when they'll be judged.
Let me pause you there because I want to hear from Joyce, who's in Hertfordshire. Joyce, good afternoon. What would you like to say, Joyce?
Oh, good afternoon to you. Hello, Chris. I hope you're still there and you can hear me.
He's there. He can hear you.
Good. Chris, you're my hero. I love you, and will you marry me? All right. Now, if you have to go to prison for sticking up for your rights, I'll make sure that you don't eat porridge, and I'll get in there and get you a good old fry-up for your breakfast, all right? And you will be carried shoulder high by the prisoners for speaking as you should do.
Okay.
We are supposed to have free speech in this country. However, one thing I have to say is that I disagree with you about a lot of other people because they don't know what they're talking about. I've worked in the oil industry for a very long time.
Okay.
And they're always banging on about the oil giant making on. The people that are actually getting the money is the government.
All right. OK, Joyce, I'm going to leave it there. You've made your point, and we know that Chris can avoid porridge in any bad circumstances. I want to take one last call. Helen in Warwickshire. Helen, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What would you like to say, Helen?
I would like to say that I'm with Chris Packham.
Okay.
I'm 87. I've never broken the law apart from speeding. But at 87 years of age, I am desperate to save this planet for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, and hopefully others following. So therefore, on this occasion, I would break the law. Why are we selling oil? Why are we allowing other companies to extract oil that isn't going to be ours? It's absolutely wicked. And this government, well, I'd put every one of them up against a wall and shoot them.
Oh, well, now, Helen, I'm sure that's just a figure of speech there. But thank you, Helen. Chris, before we go, I know that there is a march tomorrow outside DEFRA. Tell us a little bit about what's happening outside there.
Well, the State of Nature report is being published today. It's a catalogue of catastrophe, decline and disappearance when it comes to our habitats and species in the UK. We think that we should have more action than reports. It's a very good report, and you need the data to know how to affect conservation. So I've organised a rally with all of the UK conservation NGOs. We're meeting at DEFRA from 8 o'clock to 1 o'clock tomorrow. They're all represented, and we're going to be asking for greater investment in biodiversity recovery. We're also going to be asking all of the political parties to make sure that they have robust and meaningful commitments in their manifestos going into the next election so that we have something to vote for if we want our wildlife to thrive in the UK. And I should add that it's perfectly peaceful. There's going to be no paint, no glue, no powder. It's going to be a very polite us exercising our democratic right to vote. And I should add that, of course, we will not be putting anyone up against the wall. Right. That's the last thing we need. I've never been propositioned to on television before, and I will accept that proposition if I get a vegan breakfast in prison.
Okay. Chris, is it going to be lawful tomorrow?
It will be entirely lawful. I can guarantee that. We're there with the Wildlife Trust, with the RSPB, with wildlife, the World Wildlife Fund, all of the NGOs that are coming together. It's a strength in numbers, and we're going to be saying quite clearly to our government, we simply want more investment in nature recovery and restoration in the UK, something that we've proved we can do, but we need government assistance. We need a lot more money to make it effective. Okay. And that's our mission. And as I said, going forward, we need something to vote for when we get to that election, to know that any future government will continue in that way so that we can make sure that we live in a happy, healthy landscape here, and that our children and grandchildren get to hear skylarks and sea orchids and all of those things which we enjoy. OK, Chris, thank you. I really appreciate you giving us all this time. Huge thank you to Chris Packham there. We're going to move on now. After the break, is it OK not to wash every single day? We're keen to hear your thoughts on this. 0207 862 2222 is the number that you need. We'll see you after the break.
We should say that's 8 different goals from 8 different players in one game, which matched their record. That was against Sheffield United, but it also matched their league victory at 8-0 hammering of Sheffield Wednesday back in 1999. There you go. Now, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Nick and Tessa are still with me. And in a moment, we want your calls on whether it's OK not to wash every day. Tessa, you've spoken about this before. Is it OK not to wash every day?
Well, you can wash selectively. I'm a great believer in covering what I call pockets and patches. So a wartime wash, dish, 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 all done.
OK, fine. I won't go into the details of the dishes. Well, look, that's Tessa's opinion. We want yours. Is it OK not to wash every day? Give us a call, 0207 862 2222. Stop laughing, Tessa. That's Tessa's thoughts. I think Nick slightly disagrees with the dishing bits, but we'll find out what Nick thinks in a moment. But I want to find out what you think. 0207 862 2222 is the number that you need. But whilst you're dialing in to let us know your thoughts, let's give you an idea of today's top trending topics. Now, actually, we're going to go back to something that was on Jeremy's show this morning. Ava Santina, friend of the show, appears on our show very often, is now trending on X. This is after GB News has suspended their host Laurence Fox after he made comments about the journalist Ava and asked what self-respecting man would climb into bed with her. He also used some really horrific language. This is how Ava responded to those comments earlier this morning.
Yeah, I'm really hurt by it. I am. I'm shocked by it, actually. I'm shocked that it went out. And I'm shocked that... Actually, do you know, this is the sort of talk that you worry that men have about you when you're not in the room. There's always sort of a worry in the back of your mind, which is, are people actually interested in what I'm saying or what I'm doing, or are they just looking at me for physically?
Tessa, we've had, whilst we've been on air, other presenters on GB News disagreeing with the comments, saying they should never have been made. I think Jacob Rees-Mogg has commented on them as well. Of course, he's one of the people who appears on GB News. What did you make of them?
You'll be deeply shocked by this, I'm sure. It doesn't surprise me. I pre-recorded an interview with Laurence Fox, and it never made air because he felt compromised by the questions I asked him. So he has one rule for himself whereby he can say anything, including compromising the integrity in a revolting misogynist way about a fellow human being and a woman, exposing her. And it was so distasteful on so many levels. I worry about giving it further oxygen. I want to shut down him, remove him from public discourse. And I need to see GB News suitably penalised, because actually you've got to keep public debate clean, for crying out loud.
They have taken Laurence Fox off air. Nick, is this where this whole idea of freedom of speech, everybody should be allowed to say whatever they want to say and express themselves, comes clashing with reality of there are things that perhaps you can't say?
I don't think anyone needs to express themselves publicly or privately like that. It's just not an effective way of communication. I don't think he's got any defence. He's got no mitigation. The best thing in the world he can do now is come out grovelling an apology. And mean it. It may do no good, but he cannot... it's never too late. And, you know, he's going to reflect upon what he's done, and he's an intelligent guy, and he must think, what possessed me? This will be the start. This will be the catalyst of change.
I can tell you,
because he cannot be comfortable going back home, knowing the damage he's done to, or hopefully he hasn't done any damage, but the upset he's caused, and think, actually, I need to get a grip of myself. I need to sort myself out.
I can tell you, as Jeremy reported before going off air, that Laurence Fox has doubled down on what he said, and he said that he didn't regret a single word of it.
Well, it's appalling. It's appalling.
But increase and that kind of stuff goes out on
as we said, perhaps giving it more airtime is not actually useful to anyone. So let's move on. A Ferrari driver banned for speeding to see dying mum. Nick, this sounds like well up your area of expertise.
It is. It was in Ireland, though, so I think it rules me out.
Okay,
he was going in excess of 140 miles an hour on the motorway to see his mum, who was dying. And you know, there is. I don't know whether he was represented, but he could argue duress of circumstance, which means he was compelled to drive in the way that he did, which the police said was dangerous per se because of the speed.
So are there...
And that is a defence, actually, for breaking the law.
There are defences for breaking speed limits?
Of course, absolutely. So he's saying that the circumstances were so compelling that I had to drive like that to avoid death or serious injury. Now, the interesting thing is, the headline is to see his mum, not to save his mum. If he was driving at that speed to save his mum, in my view, he would have been acquitted. What he should have argued, I haven't got his instructions, he probably would not succeed on a defence, but if his mum died shortly afterwards, and if there was medical evidence there to support his concerns that it was realistic, that death was imminent, etc., he could argue what's called a special reason. And there's 4 ingredients, but if that was satisfied, the court then has a discretion not to disqualify him. I don't think he's got a good result. He was disqualified for 12 months. That is not a good result.
It's interesting, isn't it, how we can shift the law accordingly, but then when people say they're saving the planet, and we have indeed seen over 600 people die because of heat in England last year, that's not...
This is a specific legal defence.
All right.
That exists.
Well, perhaps that's the one climate changers need to use now, for going forward and breaking the law. Specific legal defence for our future.
Interesting argument. Theoretically, they could.
OK, Tessa. Tessa, this one last topic we're going to have to go through quite quickly, unfortunately, because we're running out of time. But the British Museum is trending. Why?
Because they're asking for the public's help to recover over 2,000 ancient, irreplaceable, truly unique artefacts, many of which originally and contestably don't entirely belong to us. Has the British Museum lost its marbles? Of course, the bigger question that the British Museum has to answer is, are they in a fit state to hold on to some of the world's most precious and contested heritage? This doesn't look good.
Yeah, this was my response to the tweet. I said, I'll help. Oh, yeah, sure. There's some marbles I'd like to talk to you about. Of course, the Parthenon marbles still sit there in the British Museum. That would be an interesting conversation to have.
It would.
They're probably too big to smuggle out for security.
I don't think we have title to them.
Possibly.
We don't.
And yes, of course, the British Museum got given them by the government who bought them off Lord Elgin. Of course, they weren't stolen. Now, your calls on washing every day. What do you make of washing every day? 0207 862 2222 is the number that you need to let us know what you think. Now, the chief executive of British soap manufacturers PZ Cussons has said Brits have changed their bathing habits and are now washing less during the cost of living crisis. He says sales are down on products like bubble bath and body washes, with people selecting single bars of soap instead. Now, we heard Tessa's view earlier today that it's all right to, I think she said dib and dab. Dab.
With illustrations.
Pockets and patches.
With illustrations.
With illustrations. Sorry you missed that if you did. Now, Nick, what do you make of this? Is it okay to skip a day?
Cleanliness is close to godliness for a reason. And if you're clean, you perform better, you feel better within yourself. It's a much more socially acceptable way. Of course, there is a cost of living crisis. We can wash or bath much more quickly, save water. So if you shower for 1 minute, you use 10 litres of water. That's fine. That's quite permissible. That's saving the planet. It's economical. And there's nothing wrong with using soap. You can use water to clean yourself. So, for me, people who are not washing are using the cost of living crisis as an excuse for their own personal hygiene.
Really? I mean, there's got to be some people out there who are going to have had to make huge cuts to their lifestyle. And actually, one of those things...
But it's a fundamental need. It's a fundamental need to keep ourselves clean.
Okay. It's a national obsession. It's actually quite nice to be able to read people's mood through their pheromones and their smells. And we wash so obsessively and then perfume ourselves on top of that.
All right.
It's almost like a sort of barrier between us. Can I just say, I haven't paid any water bill for the last 8 months because I had a meter fitted, and hey presto, I discovered I was massively in credit because in my house we do not wash every day.
You do patches and pockets.
And I dump my...
But that is washing.
But not
washing everywhere, but you're washing all the relevant bits.
Yeah.
Okay.
That counts as washing.
Let's not get into too much detail. Lewis in Birmingham. Lewis in Birmingham. Good afternoon, Lewis. What would you like to say?
I have to say, and I'll be honest with you have to wash every day. It is a necessity, regardless of a cost of living crisis.
Okay. All right. Do you have to wash with soap?
Of course you have to use soap, otherwise it's just water.
Yeah, well, you sort of wash yourself with just water. Is that not acceptable?
No, you have to have soap to get all the bacteria and the germs and the nastiness of your skin. You cannot start your day without washing.
Okay. What about do you when you say washing, is a shower acceptable? Do you have to have a bath?
A shower it's quick, it's easy, it takes no more than 5-10 minutes of your life. Soap and water will do the job.
Okay, Tessa, what's wrong with that?
First of all, Lewis, you're quite wrong. You're stripping your skin of its essential oils if you bang soap and hot water all over yourself.
In moderation.
Yeah, you don't. In fact, it can be an irritant soap, especially for those with eczema. And secondly, a shower, 5 to 10 minutes. My friend, I'm in and out in 2. What are you doing in that shower?
Well, please. What is he doing in the shower?
Can we just move along swiftly? Lewis has made your point, but I have to have a shower in the morning because otherwise I don't wake up. For me, it's sort of a wake up.
Oh, the privileged problem. Alexis not able to wake up.
Have a cold shower because it gets your blood cells going. It's really good for your brain.
I need my brain working. Now, Ken in West Sussex. Good afternoon, Ken. Is it okay to skip washing for 2 or 3 days and maybe just do the pockets and patches?
Oh, I agree with the pockets and patches.
Okay.
But there's one thing that I'd like to say is that the human skin has its own mechanism for cleaning itself.
Right.
And
many people
what
have
it
said
is,
that.
there's about 28 layers of skin on your body, and approximately one layer drops off every day.
Yeah,
so
we're constantly shedding skin. But Ken, the problem, and as Lewis sort of inferred to, is the odour problem. I mean, that's the bit. Is that a bit antisocial if you choose not to wash every
Yes,
day?
there's the hygiene part as well. From the hygiene point of view, I wouldn't like doctors to not wash.
But, dear Ken, if I may... I remember, no, you've just levelled at me that I don't wash. I remember as a school pen friend when you go abroad, and I went to France, and I was staggered by just how much more pungent they smelt. And I see in this survey, the French wash half as often as us, despite the fact they live in a much hotter country. And actually, I was not adverse to these exciting smells. It was like going back in time, actually. In Britain, we were far more pungent as a society. I mean, why not let it out a bit?
Well, I think it's horses for courses. Horses for courses, isn't it?
Okay. Jamie, thank you, Ken. Let's move on to Jamie in Somerset. Jamie, what are your thoughts on this?
I think it's there are obviously, washing every day, yeah. I mean, I don't agree with, washing the patches and all of this, that, the other, because,
Pockets and patches.
Pockets and patches, because, if, for example, there are some people these days that, can't, they need help washing or whatever, which is understandable, and they might only be able to wash every couple of days. But, you're just, if you don't wash every day, it's a hygiene thing as well, as the two previous callers have said. And, you're just covering it with aftershave or deodorant or whatever. I mean, it takes 5-10 minutes. Yeah, some people take 2-3 minutes. But if you're taking 2-3 minutes, in my opinion, you're not actually doing a good enough job of having a proper wash.
But you can keep yourself clean, hygienically clean, without having to have a shower every day. I mean, we know that is possible. I mean, maybe we shouldn't be wasting all that water on one shower a day. I mean, Angela on Storm's panel said she was having 3 showers a day.
Yes, that I can understand. That's probably a bit much. I mean, I tend to have one in the evening, one in the morning, and one in the evening. That's just me personally, and I'm in there for about 7-8 minutes, if that, because I'm in and out, watch all the relevant areas. But I don't agree 2 or 3 minutes in the shower. That's not long enough.
Okay, thank you, Jamie.
If we have running water, just have a cold shower. You feel clean, you feel good, you feel vibrant, and that's it.
But
then we've been told that we need to use soap.
But it's so interesting that we've normalised this behaviour. We didn't have running hot water 100 plus years ago.
We're more civilised
Are
now.
we more sophisticated? We are raping our planet. Soon there's going to be wars over water, and then we'll be smelling differently. I'm telling you that right now.
I've got 1 minute left. I'm going to speak to Christian in Leicester. Christian, good afternoon. What would you like to say?
Hi there. I just think as long as you're not working hard, getting dirty, then...
There we go. All right. Christian, say, as long as you're sort of not exerting yourself in order to...
Who's he trying to kid?
My dad was a farmer.
Right. So did he wash every day?
not every day, and we knew what kind of job he was doing. If he'd been tipping or dupping or gathering, you could tell from the smell sometimes whether he'd been with the sheep or the cows. You know, he wasn't a particularly clean man in that respect, but you know, he was a big farmer. He was a hunter-gatherer, and in some ways there was an honesty about his.
He didn't do the patches and pockets?
No, he didn't. And actually, there were times when I saw his collie dogs lick his dirty feet, but that's a different story.
Okay, let's.
Thank you very much. Oh God, I wonder what you.
I definitely think it's time to go now. It's time to go. That's it for today. Thank you to Nick Freeman and Tessa Dunlop. They've been an absolute joy. And thank you to Chris Packham as well for giving us all this time. Jeremy's back at 9:15 tomorrow morning. Have a wonderful afternoon. See you all the same time tomorrow.